News from RTV6.
I'm Katie Hines at the State House, where Governor Pence is holding a press conference momentarily on ISTEP Plus testing. We're expecting him to address questions surrounding the test's length. We're taking insight now to the governor live.
Learn that the ISTEP Plus test has more than doubled in length. For instance, third graders previously faced an exam of roughly 6 hours of testing total are now facing 11 to 12 hours of testing. This comes most disappointingly after repeated assurances by the Department of Education that this would not happen. In fact, in testimony before the State Board of Education, the assessment chief for the Indiana Department of Education, when asked about any additional testing, simply said, and I quote, "There will be a few more questions." Well, let me be very clear on this point. Doubling the length of the ISTEP Plus test is unacceptable, and I won't stand for it. Doubling the testing time for our kids is a hardship on them, it's a hardship on families, it's a hardship on our teachers. And this is a moment that calls for decisive action. We must take decisive action to shorten this test, even while ensuring that we maintain the integrity of the test, the integrity of our overall assessment system, and the integrity of our accountability through A to F. Parents and teachers, as became evident to me over this weekend, parents and teachers across Indiana are stunned and outraged at this news. And so am I. We need to fix this, and we will. We still have time to get this test right. But we must act immediately to do that. Therefore, in full consultation with the leadership in the House and the Senate, just moments ago I signed an executive order using my authority as governor to shorten the test and lessen the burden on our kids, on our families, and our teachers. I have instructed the Office of Management and Budget to contract with a nationally recognized expert in accountability and assessments to help us do that. We are looking for actionable recommendations to the Indiana Department of Education and the State Board of Education and our vendor to substantially shorten the test. I'm calling today as well on the Indiana Department of Education and our vendor at CTB McGraw-Hill to give full access to our consultant of all relevant information concerning the new ISTEP Plus exam. Specifically, we will be asking our consultant to evaluate the exam in a way that will preserve the state's accountability system, preserve and ensure the assessment's validity, and to provide us with immediate actionable changes in the exam that would shorten its length. An initial analysis of the exam by experts familiar with it suggests that there are changes, particularly concerning the addition of a reading section and a social studies section that could substantially reduce the length of the test to the benefit of Indiana's kids and teachers. But we'll leave it to the experts to make their recommendations. Once we receive these recommendations to shorten the ISTEP test, we'll be calling on the State Board of Education and the Indiana Department of Education to work with our vendor to implement these changes immediately in time for this spring's test. Now, let me say that when one examines the process that this has gone through, it's understandable why parents are frustrated, and I'm one of them. We've gone through a process here in Indiana where we asserted the right of our state to establish our own standards, and we did that. And then, because of well-publicized difficulties in the State Board of Education, there was an 8-month gap from when we adopted the new standards to when we were even able to commence the process of crafting a new test and a new exam that would implement those as is required under our federal waiver. The State Board of Education repeatedly encouraged the Department of Education to pilot this new ISTEP test in May of last year, in the fall of last year. But again and again was told that the length of the test would not be dramatically different. There has been a disappointing lack of transparency in this process. And I can't help but feel like this is all a byproduct of the dysfunction that has existed at the State Board of Education over the past 2 years. And that too must be corrected. Now let me close and I'll take questions by saying, look, we grade our kids every day. We can test and grade our schools every year. Parents have a right to know how their kids are doing in school and how their schools are doing overall. And as Governor of the state of Indiana, I am committed to see this test through, to bring common sense, to shorten this test for Hoosier families, to make sure that this test is implemented in a way that ensures its validity and gives us the data that we need to be able to provide the kind of accountability in our A to F system in our schools that will keep Indiana in the forefront of educational attainment and improvement. Many of you were around when I announced our goal for this administration, that by the year 2020, we would have 100,000 more kids in B or better schools in the state of Indiana. Well, you've got to grade your schools to have kids in B or better schools. Proper assessments that are aligned with our standards and that are aligned with common sense and don't overly stress our kids are essential to that. And the accountability of our A to F system is also essential to that. And we'll see it through. We should have copies of the executive order for you, as well as a statement, and I'd be open to questions.
Governor, how confident are you that you'll be able to accomplish this with that dysfunction that you just talked about with the state board, the superintendent, the back and forth over who should chair meetings and agendas? How confident are you that they'll be able to get all this done?
Well, let me first speak to my confidence about shortening this test. The initial review by experts that we respect, those that are familiar with the present situation, believe that suspending a social studies portion of the ISTEP Plus test, as well as there's a high probability that the IDOE unnecessarily added a reading section to the ISTEP exam, that the removal of these two elements would substantially shorten the length of this test. Now that's anecdotal. That's just a flyby by some experts that we respect. But we are contracting today, and the Office of Management and Budget will have details for you when this is completed. Contracting today with nationally recognized experts in testing and assessment, and we'll be asking for their recommendations. But my executive order asks for recommendations about how we shorten the test, and I believe we have time. We will bring expertise to bear starting today, and that we will be able to shorten this test and bring it more in line with the length of testing that Hoosier kids and Hoosier families have experienced in the past. And there's no reason why the ISTEP Plus test should take twice as long as previous tests. I believe that by acting today, by beginning this analysis today, providing this analysis to the Department of Education, to the State Board, and to our vendor, we'll be able to move expeditiously to make those changes.
What kind of communication did you have with...
let me go with Jim. Excuse me one second.
Who are the experts you're talking?
We'll get you a full list. We're currently talking to a couple of people. There's frankly a couple of testing and assessment experts that are already on contact with the State Board of Education today. But Office of Management and Budget is working out those contracts right now. Time is of the essence. It's important that we move on this now. That's why I pulled together leaders of the House and Senate this morning, and we talked through various options. I informed them of my intention of signing an executive order. But simply waiting on on the State Board of Education, which is currently trying to schedule an emergency meeting with the impending first round of our ISTEP Plus test happening in March. I just wasn't quick enough. We needed to move today.
How can you say that?
I promised you I'd go with you next.
Well, did you include Superintendent Ritz? What kind of communication have you had with Superintendent Ritz directly? Have you had any meetings with her to talk about this issue before taking such dramatic action on your own?
I did. We've informed the superintendent's office of our actions, and the superintendent and I spent about an hour together a week ago, and we talked about the new testing. And she informed me that that there was some increase in the amount of time, but she pointed to the past history of, I think it was 2008, 2009, to suggest that actually, historically, this would take students less time than it did in that period of time. That's why, frankly, I was just stunned to learn from the State Board of Education that that the length of time to take the ISTEP Plus test has doubled. And we'd spent an hour together a week ago, and I didn't hear anything of the kind.
So you have not talked to her since then to try to work this out without taking this step?
But we've informed her staff of what we're prepared to do in consultation with legislative leadership. And we'll be providing this analysis. The state of Indiana will be paying for this review and providing it to the Department of Education and the State Board of Education and our vendor for implementation. We're going to shorten this test.
How quickly can the review be accomplished? Do you think that the test will have to be pushed back a little bit?
My understanding is that we can, given some of the elements that I mentioned, there may be some obvious fixes here. Some experts that we've heard from believe there's a high probability that the Indiana Department of Education unnecessarily added a reading section to the ISTEP, which significantly extended the length of the assessment. Well, we'll find that out when we look at it. But I want to leave that to the experts, but I've been assured that moving quickly, expeditiously, that we'll be able to get actionable recommendations in time for us to act on this and implement this test this spring.
The Department of Education has the contract with the testing vendor and all that. Can you actually force them to make any changes?
Well, let me say the executive order today had to do with mobilizing state resources to contract with nationally recognized consultants to make recommendations to shorten this test. We are asking the Indiana Department of Education, apart from the executive order, we are requesting that the Indiana Department of Education and our vendor fully cooperate with this review. And I am confident that they will provide that information. And then once that recommendation, those recommendations are made by people whose expertise in this area will be above reproach, that will be submitted to the Indiana Department of Education, which is wholly responsible for crafting and administering this test. It will also be submitted to the State Board of Education. And I see no reason why they wouldn't accept the professional recommendations of experts to lessen the burden that this test that has doubled in length on our kids and on our families.
Governor, excuse me, Governor Pence.
Scott.
Last April, the Department of Education's plan was for a pilot of a portion of this test in September. That was overruled by your appointees on the state board. You placed a lot of the blame here on Superintendent Ritz. Should it be more equally shared with the state board?
Overruled by members of the state board. Members of the state board, your information, Scott, your information is wrong. Members of the state board advised the Department of Education to pilot the ISTEP Plus test in the spring of 2014 and advised, they can't order, advised the Indiana Department of Education to pilot the test in the fall of 2014, and that did not occur. On the third day of September, let me check my facts here, make sure I'm right. September 3rd, 2014, the Department of Education's Chief Assessment Officer was asked a question by a board member whether the test would be significantly lengthened, and the answer was, as is available, I guess, on YouTube now, quote, there will be a few more questions to build the vertical scale. So I don't know where you're getting your information. The State Board of Education was calling on this being piloted in the spring of last year, in the fall of last year, and part of what I understand, I'm not an expert in this area, I'm here on behalf of our kids and our parents and our teachers. Part of the problem here is that we are we are doing the pilot and the testing all at the same time, and that's what's resulting in the hardship. Please, Scott.
Yeah, how much of this, Governor, is on going to RITS?
Well, I don't want to make it personal. I mean, look, but the Indiana Department of Education is completely responsible for crafting the test and conducting the test in the state of Indiana. That is their responsibility. The State Board of Education oversees the Department of Education, and frankly, that's why I just said I was deeply troubled to learn of this news, and frankly, I was stunned to learn that the ISTEP Plus test had doubled. And there has been a frustrating lack of transparency here, and I think it has its roots in the dysfunction in the State Board of Education. Let's talk. Let's talk about this plainly as among adults. There have been a lot of problems in the State Board of Education over the last 2 years. That was why last December I announced that I was unilaterally closing down my Office of Education and Career Innovation in an effort to promote an atmosphere of greater cooperation and greater harmony. It's also why I'm calling on members of the General Assembly to allow the Republicans and Democrats who serve on the State Board of Education to elect their chair, as most of the boards and commissions in the state of Indiana do. And I believe that would contribute greatly to alleviating the kind of confusion and the kind of dissension that has resulted in this this really shocking result for Hoosier families.
Governor, we have a new standards, new test that you want to now cut in half. Do you still want these?
I don't want to cut it in half. I want it to be the same length as the last ISTEP test.
Do you still want the test scores to count in terms of
absolutely,
teacher salaries?
Absolutely.
Nobody knows what's coming?
Look, we test our kids every day. We can test our schools once a year. The accountability that we have has contributed to the progress that Indiana has been making in educational attainment and student achievement in recent years. And I'm committed to that. When the superintendent and I met last week, one of the things that she suggests is that maybe we could forego the A to F accountability for a year because of the difficulties with this test. Well, I don't want to break the A to F program. I want to fix the test. I mean, the reality is parents deserve to know how their kids are doing in school. And parents deserve to know how their schools are doing in Indiana.
Governor, what could they know after the kids actually take the test? How can we judge the test and its length and the kids haven't actually lived through it?
I have every confidence that our vendor, working with the Department of Education, can administer an assessment in the ISTEP Plus test. This is the problem about the length of it. I mean, it's not reasonable in a year where Indiana went through the process of adopting our own standards. They were written by Hoosiers and for Hoosiers. We added elements to our standards that have greatly strengthened our schools and student outcome. But it is not necessary to double the length of this test to get an assessment of how our kids and how our schools are doing. And I'm very confident that by bringing some national expert analysis to bear, we'll be able to bring forward some recommendations to shorten this test to a more reasonable length and get the kind of assessment that will support our A to F system and the accountability that we must see through. Yes?
local school districts say one of the reasons why the test is longer is because grades 3 through 8 now will have to take a practice test component. But I was on the phone with EDSC this morning. They said they were told by the department they could do the practice test more as classroom instruction, more so than a standardized test. I mean, if they were allowed to do the practice test component in the classroom and not as, a testing method, would that help ease your concerns? Because that would reduce the time that they spend in standardized testing.
Well, there's a lot of people that know a lot about education, including many in this room. I'm not an expert in education. My wife often reminds me of that, okay, from her many years in the classroom. We're going to turn to the experts on this test. But my expectation is that we would not cut the test in half, as I expressed that once. My expectation is that we would significantly reduce the length of this test on Hoosiers and Hoosier families and Hoosier kids. And I fully expect that we'll be able to bring this test in line with the average length of ISTEP tests in the past. Go ahead.
When you speak to a lot of people in the classroom, educators and teachers, they felt like over the past few years they've kind of been caught in the middle of this with all the standard changing, accountability. They had to learn all these new standards over the summer, basically prep up for this new test. Do you feel like, they're going to be under even more pressure now if this test changes that they've kind of been preparing students for? Should they get a year off, do you think, in terms of accountability for the exam? Or I'm sure you spoke to that. I think you hear a lot of...
Yeah, I've made it very clear, and I'll say it again. We test our kids every day. We can test our schools every year. And we can hold our schools accountable. Performance measured is performance enhanced. And the A to F grading system in Indiana has contributed to an environment of improving student achievement across the board in our schools. That's why when I articulated my objective, I said our aim would be, with more than 100,000 kids in DNF schools in Indiana, is I want to see by 2020, I want to see 100,000 more kids in B or better schools. The foundation of all of that is our accountability system. That requires testing on an annual basis, testing that's credible, that's valid, testing that's that is reflective of the high standards that people of Indiana expect, but then it also requires the accountability of our A to F system. And as governor of the state of Indiana, I'm determined to see that through.
We have time for 2 more questions.
What's an acceptable length? You said that they basically doubled the length, and you said you want to go back to what it had been previously, which would seem like cutting it in half. But then you said that wasn't what you were calling for.
Yeah, I know. I just was talking to the guy in the back row.
But what is acceptable? You have a very short time to get this done. You have all these experts coming in. It doesn't sound like you actually have the authority to tell the DOE what to do.
That's right.
But what would be acceptable to you? What's a win here for you?
Well, I'd like to see the ISTEP Plus test reflect the average length of previous ISTEP tests. What I was reacting to was the gentleman in the back of the room that said that I wanted to cut it in half. I don't want to be held to a measuring line that 50%. I get that. But I'm saying to you, if the test has doubled in length from last year, I think reducing the test significantly back down to the average level of previous ISTEP tests in the length of time. Third graders, for instance, previously, third graders, it was an average of about 5.9 hours to do the exam. Now it's between 11 and 12 hours. And okay, I'll grant you that's a cut in half, okay?
It's getting a little confusing.
Okay, I don't want you to be confused. I look, maybe in some grade levels I want to cut in half, okay? I'll be honest with you, I'm really frustrated about this. I'm frustrated at the lack of transparency. I'm frustrated that that this got sprung on people the way it did last week. I mean, really, parents and teachers across Indiana are really upset about this, and they have every right to be. And I'm one of them. And that's why I didn't want the sun to set today without taking some decisive action to put the kind of analysis into place that will give our Department of Education, our State Board of Education, and our vendor the tools to bring this test more in line with previous practice. And maybe that's cut in half, maybe it is in some grade levels, maybe it's not quite that, maybe it's 5% either way in terms of time. Didn't mean to confuse that. What I meant to say is doubling the length of the ISTEP Plus test is not acceptable, and I'm not going to stand for it. And I talked to members of the leaders of the General Assembly this morning, and the actions that we're taking today are in full consultation with the leadership of the House and Senate.
Governor, are lawmakers willing to give you the
How about
authority?
somebody that didn't ask one?
Does it really make sense to compare this year's test to previous year's ISTEP tests when we're testing based on new standards that are admittedly by most people concerned, more rigorous and asking more students than they have in the past?
Well, I really believe that it is reasonable to ask that the test be significantly shortened and brought more in line with previous ISTEP exams. We did enhance our standards. We strengthened our standards. But I believe that within a certain variable average change, that the test should roughly be in the same burden and the same length as it was before. Just because your standards are higher and tougher, the questions might be higher and tougher, but it doesn't mean there's more of them. Now, I want to leave this to the experts. And as I said, we are, before the end of the day today, we will have for you nationally recognized experts in assessment and testing that we will be contracting with and asking them to immediately review information provided from the Department of Education and our vendor. And I anticipate their full cooperation in this. This is really, look, I get it. There's some people that want to talk about suspending our A to F system. There's some people that see the doubling of our ISTEP Plus test as some sort of a rationale for doing that. And my answer is, you don't throw out the grades, you fix the test. And that's what we're going to do. And we've got time to do it, but we had to act today to move on it. And that's the action that we've taken. How about one more? Is there anybody else? I don't want to miss it.
Could you talk about what you would tell teachers who right now are trying to prepare their students for this test?
Yeah. I would tell them that to the extent that they're beginning the prep work on the test, and they have the anxiety that we have heard from teachers, and more importantly to me from parents all over Indiana, who are very concerned about the anxiety that this is creating for their kids and their families, that help is on the way. And that the test that they are preparing for, they will be administering this spring. But it's not going to be as long as they had previously thought. And that's our real commitment.
Is it possible that the test won't be shorted after the review concludes?
No. We've asked for the expert analysis for the specific purpose of shortening the test and lessening the burden on Hoosier kids and Hoosier families. I'm very confident that we will get recommendations to do that. And frankly, if those recommendations are not forthcoming, or if the process does not move forward in an orderly way to evaluate it, then we will look for alternative means to shorten this test. But for now, I believe that providing this information to the Indiana Department of Education will make it possible for us to significantly reduce the length of this test and the burden that it places on families. But I want to say again, this is, and my intemperance to folks on the back row notwithstanding, you can tell I'm really frustrated about this. I'm frustrated with, frankly, the dysfunction that we've seen in the State Board of Education over the last 2 years. I am calling on the Indiana General Assembly to take action. In concert with my decision to close down the Center for Education and Career Innovation in my office, I'm asking on the Indiana General Assembly to enact legislation to allow members of the State Board of Education to elect their chair. I truly believe that allowing the Republicans and Democrats who volunteer their time to serve on the State Board of Education, to elect that individual who will serve as their chair, will give us an opportunity to move past this season of dissension and disputes in the State Board of Education and move into a season of transparency and accountability that will serve our kids and serve our schools for years to come. I can't help but feel, I mean, there's some people in this building want to talk about doing away with our A to F system. There's some people see all of this as a thinly veiled effort to sideline accountability. Well, you all know me well enough to know I don't speculate on motives, all right? But at minimum, it's clear to me this is a byproduct of the dysfunction of the State Board of Education, and we've got to fix it. We've got to fix this test, make sure it's implemented in a reasonable length this year, that it has the validity to be able to support our A to F accountability system and the publishing of those school grades later in the year. And we've got to fix the State Board of Education going forward so that it can work and function in a way that will serve our kids and serve our families. And that's what we're determined to do.
Thank you, everyone.